So thank you all for coming. We have a great event for you tonight. We're going to be talking about broadband mapping. This is Legal Hack, broadband infrastructure. How many of you have been to a Legal Hackers event before? So just a few. Okay, great. So let me tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do. What is that? Oh, sure. This is for the internet. It's not going to project at all. But if I am too quiet, just let me know and I'll speak louder. So DC Legal Hackers is a group of lawyers, technologists, policymakers who care about the intersection of law and technology. We like using technology to improve law, legal practice, and policy making. And many of us are policy wonks, and so we like talking about the policy implications of technology and how policy can be used in ways to improve entrepreneurship, innovation, these sorts of things. So we have a number of different types of events. We have panels like this. We will be having workshops soon, learning how to code if you're a lawyer, learning more about policy if you're a techie. We also have had and will have hackathons. The hackathons are open to both non-coders and coders alike. We try to pick problems where everyone can collaborate and come up with interesting solutions to legal policy issues, to legal policy tech issues. And so I briefly wanted to talk about things that are related to social media. Here's our meetup page. If you haven't joined, please join. Feel free to encourage your friends to join. We also have a Twitter that's at DC Legal Hackers. And the Legal Hackers movement as a whole has a hashtag, and that's hashtag Legal Hack. So Legal Hackers actually grew out of the New York Legal Hackers. They have 600 members up there. We started maybe about 4 to 6 months ago, and just so happens that over the course of those few months, there are now about 10 legal hacking groups throughout the country, and a few sprouting up around the world as well. So turning quickly to thank yous, I'd like to first thank our excellent panelists and our moderator. We're really looking forward to the discussion. I'd like to thank Logic for hosting us. This is an awesome space. I like the idea of being in a garage for the event. I don't know if these slide up, but I like the optics at least. I'd like to thank the FCPA Privacy and Data Security Committee. They've helped promote the event, and they're co-sponsoring the event tonight. And then finally, I'd like to thank Paul Brigner and ISOC DC. They are live streaming the event. If your friends couldn't make it, they should feel free to go online and they can watch the live stream. And they can even watch it later if you want to go back and see what happened. Next, I'd like to talk about a few upcoming events. The first 2 upcoming events are actually in New York. On February 7th, something that's near and dear to the legal hacker's heart is the reInvent Law Conference. reInvent Law was founded by a number of professors, 2 professors, I guess, at Michigan State University, and they draw legal reform activists from around the world, lots of legal tech startups, and others for really, really interesting panel discussions. And so that's going to be happening on February 7th. And then on February 8th and 9th, the New York Legal Hackers, in conjunction with DC Legal Hackers and some other groups to be announced, will be having our Data Privacy Hackathon. And so that's sure to be excellent right now. Rebecca and I have been working on some of the problems. Again, if you're a coder, if you're a non-coder, feel free to come.
If you're in New York City for the weekend,
I encourage you to make a weekend out of it and come up. And then 2 of our upcoming events. On March 5th, we have a legal tech demo night. We're going to get some startups from around town to come in and talk about things that they've been working on in the legal tech sphere. And then in June, we have, and it all started as a hashtag, I'm not quite sure what it's going to be, but we're working on it, a drone barbecue. And so if you can tell me what a drone barbecue is, if you have suggestions, I'm all ears, but I know that it's going to be awesome. And then final hacking promo, I was up in New York a few weeks ago, and I went to Hack the Met. If anyone is in New York and looking for an awesome tour of a storied institution, kind of remixed and retold, Hack the Met is amazing. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alan to give a quick 30 seconds on what we're doing here today.
All right, hello. My name is Alan DeLevy. I guess I'm the resident coder of the three co-organizers here. I've been developing software for a few years, and then a couple years ago, I went to law school. I'm still in it. I'm very interested in telecommunications policy as a law student, and broadband mapping interests me also as a coder. It's an issue where code and policy hit head-on. I can develop applications that could be useful, not just me, any developer could develop applications that could be useful for business discussions, policy discussions, or any other type of advocacy. Being able to simply answer the question, is there enough broadband here, may seem very simple, but it can lead to a whole lot of implications of whether public or private investment flows into that area, and these are very important determinations that need to be made, and I think in this panel we'll be discussing how they're made, what types of tools are used, and further policy areas that they impact.
Great. My name is Rebecca Williams. I'm one of the co-organizers. I was part of New York Legal Hackers with Jameson as well. I'm just going to do a quick rundown of why everyone on this panel is awesome and a little context as to why I'm excited about this talk. You guys are going to explain broadband to me at every level, which is very exciting. So at the very end, our moderator, Julia Polindi, is a senior associate at National League of Cities. She's been there for 8 years. She's worked on a variety of issues from public finance, transportation, and telecom. She's currently working in the City Solutions and Applied Research Department, where she works specifically on technology infrastructure issues. Next over is Virginia Maloney. She came down from New York City. She's working as a senior project manager at New York City's Economic Development Corporation, and she's working directly on New York City's broadband beta mapping and wired NYC issues. So she'll give us New York's perspective. If you guys haven't checked it out, we'll have it up on the screen later, but New York City's broadband beta map is worth checking out. Next over, we have Neville. She's the director at State Broadband Initiative. So she's going to provide the state perspective. She's also done a lot of OpenGov, Gov 2.0 stuff, so she'll be able to shed some open data transparency perspective. Then next up is Mke Byrne. He's the Geographic Information Officer, FCC. He works directly on the federal broadband mapping issues, and he'll have a lot to say about mapping. And then all the way at the end is Greta Byrum. She works at Open Technology Institute, which is part of the New America Foundation. They work specifically on technology issues and digital divide, and she'll be able to provide that perspective. Nervous? Okay.
Cool. And with that, turn it over to Julia. Thanks.
Great.
Do you guys want a second one? Yeah.
Thanks. So I think we'll just start off the panel with having each of you give us a quick overview of your individual agencies and your work with mapping.
Great. Starting with me. So I'm Virginia Maloney. I'm here representing the New York City Economic Development Corporation, which is a quasi-governmental nonprofit that promotes job growth and focuses on economic development issues in New York. I specifically focus on technology. We interact very closely with the private sector and try to identify barriers to growth and then create specific initiatives like the NYC Broadband Map. I don't know if you want to pull it up. It's nycbbmap.com. Or maybe too premature, but it's a map that drills down at the building-specific level to show where infrastructure is in New York City and help businesses find potential office spaces where they can relocate, and also identifies demand. This is part of a suite of initiatives that we're focusing on in New York. Broadband's a critical issue for us, so we have projects that help expand physical infrastructure and then other initiatives that build on awareness in New York.
Hey, I'm Ann Neville. I'm at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA. So if you're not familiar with NTIA, it's the executive branch organization that's the president's principal advisor on telecommunications and information policy issues. I run a program called the State Broadband Initiative, which includes grants to states to collect data that powers the National Broadband Map, which is a joint effort between NTIA and the FCC. And our grant program also funds projects that support the digital economy in different states. So it's a whole smorgasbord of things. And if you're interested in what the states are doing, you can actually, and if you go to ntia.doc.gov/SBDD, that is our program, and you can see information about what we gave one, as part of the Recovery Act, we gave one grant to each state to do the data collection and also to do a lot of to do all these other kinds of projects. Mike.
Hi, so thanks for inviting us tonight. It's really great to be here. My name is Mke Byrne. I'm with the Federal Communications Commission, and a predominant thing that I'll be talking about tonight is the National Broadband Map, which is really a statutory obligation of NTIA. It's just the FCC helped out, and we did some of the technical implementation. So that's broadbandmap.gov. But what's being on the screen right now is the second thing that I'll really be talking about is MAPS implementation at FCC. So fcc.gov/maps is a predominant project that I work on as well. In terms of the organization, the way I like to think of the division between NTIA and FCC is NTIA is a sort of policy body for the president and owns government spectrum. The FCC owns commercial spectrum. So we kind of operate in the regulatory authority of spectrum that commercial entities use. NTIA offers and operates in the spectrum in the government space. We're outside of the administrative function. We're an independent body. We have 5 commissioners, and they vote on policies and regulations around that commercial spectrum. The last thing I'd say about our agency, which I find remarkable, is I wake up every day. I'm not a lawyer or an economist or an engineer, which is like 99.9% of our agency. I'm a geographer. So when I wake up, I kind of look at stuff we do and go, oh my gosh, we do that too. We have these functions that have these wide-ranging, really fascinating things that MAPS lend itself to be a really tremendous opportunity for displaying and analyzing data that we haven't done before. So it's a great place to work.
Great. Thanks a lot to Legal Hackers. Great to be here. My name's Greta Byrum, and I work with the Open Technology Institute at the New America Foundation. So we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. But unlike most think tanks, we have a group of people who work actually in the field, work directly with community organizations who are working on access to broadband services, among other things, directly with communities. So in that work, a lot of what we do is try to connect people with available resources. So we are sort of the consumer side, using the resources provided by agencies like NTIA and FCC, and trying to bring back to them sort of the perspective of folks on the ground, what they experience when they're using these resources. And so, just as a jumping off point as far as, what we find when using a resource like the National Broadband Map, we often find that there's a difference between access and adoption, and this is something that I think we'll probably get into here, whereas the National Broadband Map tends to show access, so it shows, where you can get different levels of broadband service. It doesn't show adoption, so it doesn't show how many people or what percentage of people actually are subscribing to internet services. So essentially, we have turned, instead of using National Broadband Map data, we often turn to this other data from FCC, which is called Form 477 data. And that data is self-reported by the telecom companies, and it shows actual adoption at the census tract level. So this is the data we primarily use for mapping purposes, and we'll use it for things like, trying to understand, look at a city, look at subscription rates in that city. And what we found is something pretty surprising, which you don't see when you look at the National Broadband Map, which is that especially in some of the poorer cities, the inner city, the sort of central not the central business district, which tend to be pretty well connected, but the places where maybe like white flight happened in the 1970s, very, very low adoption. So in places like Detroit or Philadelphia, as low as 10 to 20% adoption in those places. So we tend to think of, the problem of access to broadband as being a rural problem, but what we are seeing in our maps is that it's very much an urban problem, but that's when you look at adoption, not at access. So that's just, I'm sorry to get too deep in the weeds here as far as like actual thematic stuff, but I think, that begins to explain like how we start to use the resources that exist.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Gives some really good ideas on how we can structure this conversation. Before I kick off with the questions, I encourage the panelists to feel free to respond to each other and just feed off each other's comments. And also, we do have time for questions from the audience, so we will make sure to get to those and leave plenty of time for that. My first question is kind of based off of something Mike had said when we were just standing out there chatting, and it would be helpful to know what was the impetus for your agencies to go out and start building these really valuable data sets, and what was your kind of initial hope and expectation with them, and how has that changed? Is there anything that you're particularly happy with, things or directions that have kind of switched gears as you've gone forward with this? Anybody want to?
You want to start? Well, so let me, I think it'd probably be helpful to give just a little bit of legislative background. I think one of the things that, we often come to the issue with, I'm looking to solve this question, so what data set is available? And from an agency perspective, a lot of times the question is, we want to do something, what legal authority do we have to do it? And did we get an appropriation to do it so that we actually have money to fund whatever this data collection is? And so in the case of the National Broadband Map and the broadband availability data set, when there was a bill called the Broadband Data Improvement Act that was passed in 2008. And it was passed, it was bipartisan, but no one funded it. And it had a lot of different activity around getting more data, because one of the things with broadband mapping is that states were actually doing a lot of this work before the federal government was. Mike and I worked together in California. There were a couple of different states that did this work. And so when BDIA was passed, it was great, but there was no money. So when the Recovery Act was passed, someone put in this wonderful language as they were talking about the over $7 billion to fund broadband infrastructure and to fund broadband adoption programs. Someone said, and you will build a searchable national map of broadband availability pursuant to, and they cited BDIA. And that was really exciting because that gave us the authority to give grants to individual states to go out and collect the data, which was a wholly different way of getting data into a national data set than had been done before. So I think that just, and then due to our mutual interests and mutual various technical expertise, NTIA and the FCC partnered to really make that a reality. And so that's, that was the beginning of it. And, Mike and I came on and have worked together for the last 4 years to build this. And an interesting thing around the adoption side is we focused on the question of availability because that's what the legislation gave us the authority to collect data on. And we got down to a really granular level, census block. Prior to that, the best thing that there was census tract data. And census blocks, there are 11 million compared to 68,000 tracts, yeah. And so it's, it's an interesting, that scale difference really comes into play. But so that's, I think those were just some of in the terms of the historical background. And then you want to talk about, you've got lots of other initiatives.
Yeah, so the catalyst in federal government is almost always the same thing. It's almost always statute. And Anne, I think, paints a really good picture of the National Broadband Map's point of departure, the BDIA and American Reinvestment Recovery Act. Internal at the FCC, there are several other functions that have a similar catalyst that may or may not be statutory. So other than, someone other than me in the room can comment much more effectively. We have section 706, which really describes the rate at which broadband is being deployed in a timely and effective manner, something along those lines. Again, I'm not a lawyer. There's the Universal Service Fund, which was established to ensure universal telephony in the United States. And 2 years ago, the FCC made a rulemaking to carve off some of that fund to establish the Connect America Fund, to establish universal broadband deployment at a goal of 3 megabits down, 768 up. And so those are just two examples of internal policy guidelines that require us to either collect or report data in a particular fashion, and we use maps to sort of do that. Again, the real point of departure from a federal government perspective is either statute or internal policy.
And to introduce the broadband map at the city and local level, we really relied on the work that had been done at the federal and state level and pulled a lot of that data into the map that we use. The demand for the local, hyper-local version of the map that focuses on specific tenants that are introducing feedback about the quality and speed and type of service that's available within those office spaces has also been critical. So I think to your point earlier about how this is not necessarily an access issue in an urban setting, that's not what we've seen in New York. You often find that like maybe the main tech hubs like Flatiron District in Manhattan doesn't have an issue with access, but if you're going out into Brooklyn, you might find neighborhoods that try as they might, still can't get high-speed internet access there.
Well, we don't, I mean, yeah.
Maybe it doesn't really have one thing, which is when you just mentioned about the Flatiron, and I think that leads into this. The other part of the funding, we gave about $300 million in grants to states to collect data for 5 years, twice a year, and also to do these other activities related to the digital economy. And one of those is broadband planning activities. And it can sound really, really boring, a broadband task force, broadband planning, and they're incredibly critical. And they've used the data to help them guide their discussions around where access is and where it isn't, and often supplementing it with local surveys to look at adoption issues, and then also to go hyper-local, because there are things that at the national level it wasn't feasible or it didn't make sense for us to collect because they weren't relevant for the whole country. But if it's relevant for that city or that state, we really wanted them to be able to do that work. And so that's why that funding was there to support planning, and also, as I think Mike will talk about a lot more, development of the infrastructure in a really open manner so that people could appropriate it and use it for their, for their own needs.
Yeah, I will say, yeah, I don't mean to say that there aren't issues with access also in some of the urban settings, but what I should say is that we do do a lot of trying to understand the relationship between broadband data and other kinds of socioeconomic data. So that's a huge part of what we do is start to layer like American Community Survey data, which is something that you guys did with the National Broadband Map, and understand like where there's a correspondence between, for instance, like low median household income and the lack of either adoption or of access in those areas. So, some of the things that we've done with, looking at those kinds of correspondences would be talking to local groups who could serve as kind of community hubs of broadband access. So, CBOs or local organizations that are supporting community members, or also we've done in the past consulting with cities so that they can even understand, where in this city do we have an issue, because that's not immediately apparent to a lot of policymakers who are saying, okay, it's vital now that people have access to broadband to get jobs, to get health care. Where is there a problem? Where are people relying on things like the libraries? And in those cases, how should we support the library? So there's all kinds of policy issues that emerge from, looking at the demographic and socioeconomic data alongside the broadband data.
And I think that's a great segue to the next question. And when you receive these directives and you're going about collecting data, what strategies are you using to ensure that you're accessing the most current, up-to-date information? And through your course of developing your maps, how are you kind of finding out that there are gaps in your data, or that there are missing sets that actually would kind of make sense to start collecting and incorporating into what you already have?
I'm happy to take this question, as we just went through the arduous process of collecting data for our map. We heavily relied on the state data, which I believe is mandatory to submit. So when we approached the ISPs about providing that next level, many of them already felt comfortable with the process of sharing their data and understood that was something that they should start to do for government organizations. So thank you. And many providers also weren't quite as interested as giving up their customer lists to EDC. So we developed a crowdsourcing portion of our site that depends on landlords wanting to broadcast their building as a connected building, as well as tenants who want to share the wealth and tell others about, hey, this building has great fiber internet access. In the same capacity, people can comment saying, my internet's terrible here, or request service, so they can list a provider they would like, a speed that they're looking for, so you can start to use the map as a way to see where demand is growing in the city. We also envision this as growing into more of a tool than just sort of an information source, so we hope that eventually the internet service providers will start engaging as well and try to contact those clients directly, potentially through a portal that we're looking into developing, and try to help facilitate those connections. And the third piece is other city initiatives that we're running. So part of our portfolio is actual broadband expansion, so adding in that data, as well as the Wired NYC program, which is a LEED certification for broadband buildings. So you would get a Wired NYC score based on the internet speeds available and your infrastructure capabilities. So all of that information is fed into our map as well.
I think when depending on what sector you're in, you have different opportunities and you have different constraints. So one of the opportunities in being in the government sector is you have kind of convening power. It's a lot easier to get a lot of providers in a room and very high-level folks at those groups and say, hey, this is what we'd like to do, and getting feedback and et cetera, et cetera. One of the challenges is that once you've said, all right, the policy says this, so what can we collect? And you get everyone generally in agreement that, or maybe you don't. You've got to go through something called the Paperwork Reduction Act, and I mention that because it is a challenge. I think if Mike and I were king, queen of the world, and you could quickly just on a dime say, yeah, we'd like to change X, Y, and Z about the data collection. There are lots of things we would have changed already. But we gave grants to states to have them collect certain things that cost a certain amount of money. And there were a lot of providers who said, we're going to do this. And our program is voluntary. But in New York, at the state level, they have an amazing program. And they've worked really hard to develop very good relationships and to really use every kind of leverage they have to beg, borrow, steal, and get folks involved. So we went through a really long process and a public process of what did we want to try to collect and getting that out there. And then there was a lot of pushing and pulling, frankly, because this level of broadband availability data had never been collected and kind of made public at this level. And we've got data from over 2,000 providers across the country. But one of the things the states had to tell us when we gave the grants is how were they going to verify that the data was true, because in many states, a lot of the original data sources stemmed from providers, and people had a lot of questions about was that valid intentionally or not intentionally, because most broadband providers weren't collecting data in census geography, which is a whole different, creates a whole different set of issues. And so States incorporated a lot of different verification activities and still do. And then we also incorporated a lot of work in the National Broadband Map. And maybe Mike, you want to talk about that and some of the other work that you've
Yeah,
done.
I think, so the way I was thinking about answering this question is a little different, which is, given the point of departure that we had, this sort of statutory thing, which really only said that NTIA shall create and maintain a national map of broadband availability that's searchable and interactive. So when you get down to like a functional requirement from a developer point of view, like what's searchable and interactive, right? You know, like how do I write the code that is that thing? So we bucketized, we took the strategy of bucketizing from that point. And I would say we developed 3 buckets and a guiding principle. So bucket 1 was the idea of audience. We thought Congress intended the public to be the audience, that the persona that really wanted access to this information was someone who didn't understand the landscape but was going to be a consumer. At the same time, we recognized that there's a massive need for several other personas. And we spent lots of time whiteboarding personas. At one point, I think it got to 19. And, you know, and then we actually put drawings of who these people were. We gave them names.
Mary.
Yeah, you know, we talked about Aunt Mary. We talked about a coder with a particular name. We had an image of that person. We described where they went to work and how they would interact or want to interact with something. So the persona was clearly a bucket, or the audience bucket was really important. The technical bucket was a really big one that I tended to focus on because at the time, again, this is now 4 years ago, the production of a live internet available map that had this volume of data that we wanted the response time to be well enough that the consumer wouldn't like walk away from the screen was really on a cusp. It hadn't, other than Google Maps, no one had really pushed this kind of volume of data. Definitely no one in the federal government had done it well, we would say. And so spending time on describing what a technology stack was going to be was super important, and we spent a lot of time thinking about that. And the third bucket is sort of design. In today's standards, I think that our design looks slightly dated. 3 years ago, our design for Broadband Map was revolutionary in the government space. So now you have organizations like Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, a new federal agency, that really embraces this concept of modern design when it comes to government sites. And this concept, I think, is extraordinarily important in keeping and valuing the consumer. So those 3 buckets were really
You
important.
want to go to broadbandmap.gov and for the screen, I don't think it's been up yet.
And so like the idea here on the design was like, you know, much like the previous screen, there's a single text box. So I can search in that box, and from that I can explore and so forth. The guiding principle that that I had in my head every day was we're making a map about the internet. We really have to embody the spirit of the internet in making this whole thing. So 100% of the stack was open, 100% of the data was open, 100% of the data is dog-fooded. We consume what we produce. Like, we did all of the things that young startups are doing today, and with the idea that our first version is never going to be smart enough that is going to reach all consumers, but if we build it in a scalable way, then people will consume it in other ways, and we've seen that. So those are the strategies I think that we tried to employ. Yeah.
And I would just say in terms of data that is missing, you know, a lot of our mandate and responsibility as a, you know, public service, public interest organization has to do with being the annoying bug in these guys' ear and saying, you know, this is what we think is missing. So, you know, one important data set that we'd love to see a lot more of is actually pricing data. So, you know, like one of the things that we're trying to understand all the time is in the areas where people are not subscribing to broadband services, why? And is it a question of price? Is it a question of like people can't afford it? Or is it that people don't see the relevance? Or is it that they're nervous or they, you know, are intimidated by the internet? You know, what is it? And so it would be super helpful and I think actually super helpful not just for the public interest community and the public, but also actually for industry to understand those questions. So yeah, there's.
Super valuable.
Can I add? I'll add one thing, which was to go back. We had a ton of conversations about price, and when we'd been in California, we'd wrangled with the same issue, and one of our we were in one challenge was we had a congressionally mandated deadline of February 17th, 2011, and so part of it was what could we bite off that could be done, and we knew we had to have the availability by geography, and when as we talked about pricing, and we also talked about kind of what was feasible to get done by that time. And so and one of the things we also, we've looked at and we continue to look at is, NTIA does surveys with the census and the CPS supplement, which has, I think it's about 60,000 people each time, and it asks questions around, do you adopt broadband? Why don't you? How much do you pay? And, in whether it's a state survey or the national survey, I mean, the first reason people don't adopt is because of relevancy. They don't see the relevancy. And the second reason is price. And usually, right, price and relevancy are interrelated. And there's a point at which, if it's cheap enough, it becomes, then it becomes that, that tipping point. And trying to marry up, but you have the CPS, which is done, you have privacy issues, because they were questions that were asked to a person who lives at a certain address, who lives in a certain census block. And there are a lot of census blocks where if you said that answer, you would know who made that answer. And so that there are a whole lot of privacy concerns that then come into that. But we've looked at a lot of that too, and because we asked that question of how much do you pay too much, or et cetera. And Pew asked that too, but they have 2,000 people, and so it becomes this question of how do you marry the geography when you've got these data sources all trying to answer different but interrelated questions and coming from different places and different times.
Greta, you made a really good point about how groups like New America and the National League of Cities and a lot of our other partner organizations are using this data to identify why people are not adopting and helping our audiences address those challenges. Can you all talk about some of the other users of your data and some of the kind of most popular uses of the data that you're collecting, and a little bit about that?
Do you want to start? I think from EDC's point of view, our primary goal is economic development, so we're really looking at commercial offices and how this can be used to spur job creation and growth in that way. We have yet to actually make our data portal public, but we plan to at some point, again facing sort of the legal issues of one step more granular, where you have a provider associated with a direct address. But one of our initiatives is Big Apps, where EDC has a competition to create applications based on city data and try to develop something that out of public data sources that could be beneficial. So I'd be curious what people could come up with for broadband. Mm-hmm.
We've seen, so we built 100% of our architecture on REST APIs. So 100% of the data you can go download in bulk, but you can get record by record returns from our data. And we built that with this sort of search function in mind.
Broadbandmap.gov/developer.
So he's got this one,
okay.
Which is perfect, because in this case, the URL is passing a latitude and longitude. And in this particular case, it's downtown Washington, D.C., right? So it returns the ellipse and the census block of the ellipse. So we're reporting like by block, that particular thing. And if you go to the /developer page, you'll see these individual APIs that return all these individual bits. So we know that there's been a handful of applications like broadband.usa,
Broadband.com.
something like that.
Yeah.
One of the ones. So these are like people that are resellers that use our data as a potential reselling app for getting additional consumers to develop. That happened right out of the get-go. We saw Other providers reskin our map. I'm sorry, other technology firms reskin the entire application as an opportunity to respond to additional requests for proposals for services. So that was really cool. They were like, oh, look, the federal government did this. This is how we would make it better as part of showing their technical capacity. But the fun ones for me have been what I would call unintended consequences. So broadband data is clearly the primary content, but the way we structured it allowed for lots of other people to do other things too. And those unintended consequences are often you never think of, but become your core business. So in our case, we provide a super fast, lightning fast lookup to census blocks. And that has become our predominant API return. So you pass a latitude and longitude, we give you the census codes back for that lat long. The applications that use it are, there's TurboVote, which is a national voter registration database that goes out and stands in front of like Safeway and gets people to register to vote. And they use the app in those locations to find out what county that individual is in. And they got kind of, bummed out during October when our APIs went off. We've recently been contacted by the Department of Defense, who asked us like, hey, what's your service level agreement? Because we're going to start throwing millions and millions of hits at this because we're going to use your API to determine housing subsidies for Department of Defense employees because that's all based on census geography. So we see all of these just crazy cool unintended consequences from building an infrastructure that is readily available.
I think I've talked about how we use it.
You mentioned some really cool applications. Did you see anything, interesting or innovative from big apps?
Yes, one of the programs, applications that developed that I personally found interesting, I have an environmental background, was a sustainability app where you would coordinate with grocery stores and restaurants when there was food waste, and then this group would come and pick up your food and recycle it. But My City Way was a big apps winner, which is a transportation app and sort of an everything New York City app. So we've seen some cool things come out of the program. Hopefully more.
We've had these really interesting things come out of the national level. And we've also seen a lot of really great innovation at the state level. And each state maintains its own broadband map. And that was not in a sense of duplication, but again, because we thought there were things that a state might be really interested in mashing up with the data, like say regional economic development zones, that weren't something we would put in a national map, but they might want to do for their own kinds of analysis, for their state task forces to support local things. And so there's been some really interesting work that's come out of it. Most of it has been around economic development, and it probably sounds very, no kidding, broadband and economic development today. But to tell you, 4 years ago, one of the state projects we actually funded was research around the importance of broadband and economic development. To actually do essentially a small lit review that would look at all of the work that had been done and what had come out of it, because if you talk to a lot of local economic developers at the time, and we've had these conversations, people would say, well, yeah, it's important, but how important is it, and what can I really do? And now people are really seeing the value of having the data that can help them drive the policy, or at least get through, so you're not having some argument over the table. No, there's really great availability. No, there's not. And you're just like, hey, at least relatively speaking, it's crappy availability. We need to do something with it. Or relatively speaking, there's great availability, but we've got a lot of low-income residents and they're not adopting because pricing is really high. But then you also have, like in New Mexico, they ended up creating this New Mexico Firewatch data set application through as a result of being able to develop the broadband mapping application because it had really improved the state GIS resources and had allowed them to do some mapping in the state that hadn't existed before. And now they have this really cool application that's about wildfires. Has nothing to do with broadband, but it's about wildfires. But they were able to do it because of essentially the tech support funding that they got through the program. And so that's another kind of unintended consequence.
Other ones that we've sort of danced around. We haven't gotten bites on, but we've had conversations with are Zillow and Trulia, right? So, both big, the two giants in real estate, and it was a predominant use case in my head because I relocated from California to the DC metro area, and one of the things you're doing when you relocate is you look for what school district is in, what are the taxation issues, what are, what's available to me in services. Broadband's a core function. So you would think that both of these guys would want to have plastered all over their site. You can get Mike's Cable or Juan's Net or whoever the big provider is in that area. The conversations have been remarkably interesting to us because our interpretation of what they're thinking is, yeah, that's neat that there's a government source and it seems like it's very useful, but we're more interested from a delivery to consumers, something along the lines of Walk Score, which is a third-party evaluation of combinations of data sets that say it's really good, right? Like, so, if you go look at Walk Score in downtown Seattle, it'll say high walkability value given all these other factors, and you can imagine something similar for like a broadband score. So we're not likely to be a producer of that kind of thing, but clearly broadband map data would be an input to that. And the other one that we had in our head that, again, I think that there's a niche market for is sort of like how something like Yelp would fit into this ecology. And I still think there's a market there, but clearly, the FCC is not going to develop that. But
I mean, there's DSL reports, right?
Right, yeah.
It's sort of and we had thought about, we had talked about the idea, do you have comments, right? But how do you have comments that don't end up with just sort of everyone who's really angry, right? How do you get to a Yelp where you get people who like it and people who don't, and you have the technology to try to figure out who's just spamming you and who got paid to say, yeah, it's great. And we did include some crowdsourcing feedback as part of the map, and you can see how many, if anyone, has kind of locally verified or not, and we send that data back to the states to incorporate in their verification process each time, because we know there's a challenge with both when you have so much data, getting it all right, and there's also a challenge of sometimes even in something as small as a census block, because we cut off at anything less than 2 square miles, there's still an issue of some places where there's broadband and some places where there's not. And we've tried to be, I think one of the ways, knowing we couldn't solve the total answer, one thing we also did was to really try to be very, very transparent with our process, how the data was collected, how each state provides a methodology of how they collected it, what verification they did, and it's published every 6 months. Everything that we do, all of the internal steps we take it's all published so that so people can see what we did, and you may disagree with it, and you can tell us that, but you know what we did.
I have one thing to add on the sort of cross-industry approach and the value of broadband data. We're working with the Wired NYC group, which is working very closely with a large real estate company in New York. So we have sort of the credibility of the real estate industry helping us with that. And we're working with various platforms to get the Wired score shared on those platforms as well. So you might Google that building and you'd be able to tell, oh, well, they got a verified platinum Wired score. So there's two sort of levels of Wired certification. There's the voluntary participation, where you have a uncertified score, a preliminary score that has very detailed information about your building's broadband capacity, to the point of, do you have risers in your building, or list the number of providers, are they Where, is it on every floor in your building? Does it go out to the 25th floor as well? So very detailed information about that. And then you also have a certification process, much like LEED, where these real estate companies will pay to participate and have it fully verified and then featured on real estate websites, and brokers are starting to adopt it as well. So an interesting cross-industry approach.
And I'll just mention in the nonprofit world, I sort of went into this, but one way that we've used broadband data, actually, we couldn't use the 477 data, which we love, but we couldn't use it because it was at the census tract level for Philadelphia, and we needed something smaller. So we actually used market research data to look at adoption in Philadelphia by neighborhood, which allowed us to then figure out, this was work that we did as part of BTOP in conjunction with a number of neighborhood organizations and the city of Philadelphia, to understand where to place public computer centers. So where were areas of low adoption, where publicly accessible computer centers would be useful. And it's so helpful to have fine-grained data actually to understand something like service distribution, and to make sure that something like BTOP funding is used in a responsible and appropriate way. So I think, that's something we haven't really gone into, but how geographic data can, lead to better accountability as far as, decisions that are made about funding and distribution.
I'm just going to do a quick time check to see where we are, see if we should open up the floor, or if we can continue with a couple more of these.
I think we're pretty good for
Okay.
a few more minutes.
Okay, great. So I have one last question on this data piece before I switch gears a little bit. But I know when the National Broadband Map was released and was really great in helping us do a webinar to kind of highlight it to the members of the National League of Cities, who are local elected officials. Are there any groups, and I'm particularly mindful of that group because I work directly with them, and how I think they could be using this information a little more effectively in their own community planning. Are there any groups that you would like to see using the data more, and for any specific purpose, whether it's community development or anything along those lines, and how can people here in the room or any of us on the panel take that back to our various audiences to make sure that we're kind of spreading the message on this great resource that's there, and how they can most effectively use it?
Well, I think there's definitely the local government, the local government side is really huge, and you get places where there are advocates who've been working for digital inclusion and know that this resource is there and have been using it, and you get places where folks don't know it's existed yet, and that's why we try to get out to economic development workshops, working with you guys so that people know that the resource is there. And also, local knowledge is key to good data in this sense. And so we've really tried to make sure that where we've really tried to advocate for local governments who look at the data and be part of the verification cycle, so that they're telling the state, this looks like the truth on the ground to us, or actually we're kind of concerned, this is not what I know locally, because then it helps. There's sort of limited dollars to go back and really do the kind of ground truthing work or boots on the ground kind of thing, and so that allows them to pinpoint specific places to go and to say this is a challenge. But it's so key to doing planning. As you said, you're always going to have political realities that weigh in, whether it's at local politics or at the national level. But the better informed people are with data and knowing and being upfront about whatever the caveats in that data may be, so that people can make informed decisions and drive policy as much as a data-driven way as possible.
So one thing I'd add is sort of switching gears on data assets. So a new collection that we're embarking on at the FCC is mobile broadband speed tests. So we've just released an Android app. If you go to Google Play Store and search FCC speed test, you'll see it. Maybe Alan can bring it up in a second. This is a unique test because it's an open source product that we've developed in partnership with not only the providers, but also a firm called Samnos out of the UK. So this test is really novel because it's a scheduled test. So it schedules tests 3 times a day, 2 peak, 1 off peak. It gives us up speed, down speed, latency, trip time, but also a whole bunch of other passive metrics. So phone type, signal strength, all this other stuff that allows us to really develop the landscape of speed. So one of the novel potential uses of this is in real-time situational awareness. So we clearly are going to get this tremendous map base of this stuff. Right now, we've been out 6 weeks, and we probably have, I think it's like 2.25 million tests, right, with location. And the real-time situational awareness opportunity is to, on every state police car, throw this app, right? So when Katrina or Sandy happens again, we can go, look, there's a dead zone, let's figure out how to get that communication network back up. So there's an opportunity, I think, that we're going to see increased time to markets in data that will allow for the kind of decision-making Ann was talking about on a scale that we really haven't, I think, played with yet. And this one's still like a little futuristic, but the volume of data we're getting on this is significant enough to allow it to happen.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention, we're also working with Samnos on the Measurement Lab project, which it's limited in terms of geographic applicability at the moment. We're working on some ideas for how to make it more available, but some of my colleagues there, do you guys remember how many bajillion tests worldwide have been run on?
Terabytes and terabytes.
It's
like enormous.
There's stuff on our website about
Yeah,
it.
can you pull up Measurement Lab?
Yeah, they have hundreds of terabytes of
Yeah,
data.
it's
I mean,
crazy,
Yeah.
crazy huge.
Over
Just
server
Google Measurement Lab.
data worldwide.
Yeah. So yeah, we're working with a number of partners, including Samnos, on
Yeah.
that, and that provides equivalent data, broadband data worldwide. And there's certain ways that we've looked into kind of adding potentially like a front end that would ask users for some information, geographic information. We're limited by privacy concerns in terms of really locating the speed tests at this point. But it would be such great data to really understand, performance and locate it geographically.
So switching gears over onto kind of a different tangent here, we know that robust broadband access is really vital for economic development, for a community to be able to grow economically, socially, meet a host of other priorities. Do any of you have any kind of information, either quantitative or qualitative, stories to share about how the data from your maps is kind of meeting various community goals?
Well, let me start with a story we just got from our grantee in Washington State a couple of weeks ago, who different states did local planning teams differently. In Washington, they did actual grants to different communities and who had different planning needs and working on things for a while. And this community had been trying to get more broadband and had been pushing to try to get some funding from other government sources for, I think, close to a decade. And they got a grant to put together a local planning team and really develop a full-on business plan and business case, which they had just never had the resources for. Because as much, anyone who's worked in the nonprofit sector, it's volunteers are awesome, but volunteers are also a lot of work. And so they actually had funding to honcho this thing. And they ended up just recently getting $45,000 grant, $130,000 loan to be able to build out the broadband they've been looking for. I mean, and that's a very, very causal. The broadband planning allowed them to actually put something together to show why it was viable. But we also see things like in South Dakota, where there was a company that was looking to locate. They were looking for a place where people were accent neutral, which South Dakota is, and had a low cost of living. And they used some of the broadband data to help them identify some smaller cities that actually had better broadband access than some larger, more expensive cities. Or in Utah, we had a health information exchange company that was located in a very rural community. They kept having service interruptions and poor broadband, and they said, we're going to move, and they were going to lose a couple hundred jobs. And they worked with the state broadband grantee who, using the data, actually identified a provider that they didn't know existed in the area, and were able to get an additional provider to ensure that they had a stable connection, and the company saved a couple hundred rural jobs. And so those are, at the state level, I think you're seeing these very, very pragmatic uses of the data to help drive both job retention and drive job attraction.
We, at FCC, we've done, I can think of two anecdotes, well, they're more than anecdotes, but two scenarios. One is we use National Broadband Map data to drive the Mobility Fund's auction for mobility spectrum allocation. So we have, again, this goal of getting 3G everywhere in the country, and right now we're holding a series of auctions that will auction spectrum in certain areas for availability that lack 3G coverage. And the definition is using broadband map data and other assets to help define targeted areas for this sort of reverse incentive auction thing, which is like, a really cool policy outcome. The second one is the Universal Service Fund has a portion of that fund that funds schools and libraries for broadband availability. And in June, I think, we released was it June? It was June. A PN seeking comment on a potential further action to change the way we're structuring that fund. And so we're doing all kinds of comment and analytics to help determine what it's actually going to take to get fiber to every school and library in the country, and what the real cost of that is. And one of the baseline pieces is National Broadband Map data. So we're actually doing some pretty cool analytic that actually, has an effect on communities and schools.
And we're commenting on
I'm sure you're coming. Yeah, totally.
rulemaking. So
I think we had like 8,000 questions in that PN.
So you're speaking about E-rate, right?
Yeah.
So with E-rate, for example, we've done some analysis around, what are some of the ways that that connectivity for schools and libraries could be expanded to benefit the entire community.
Yeah.
So for example, school networks that are heavily used between 8 and 3 p.m., 8 a.m. and 3 p.m., what if we expanded use of those networks to the larger community after school hours, and what kind of economic impact would that have? So we're in the stage of trying to use the data to show that there are interesting, creative ways to think about things like E-rate.
Can I make a quick data pitch? A little known part of the broadband availability data set is actually, we do have one part that is adoption. And part of what the states do is they collect broadband subscriber information from schools, libraries, health organizations, and other government institutions. And that's been a really challenging part of the data set, because collecting, just like the problems with self-reporting accuracy, when you ask a consumer, most consumers, if you say, hey, what do you subscribe to at home? And most people aren't going to say, yeah, I subscribe to the 25 to 50 meg plan. And if you go and you ask a lot of schools and libraries, it becomes equally as complex in finding the right person, and also issues around districts and individual schools, et cetera. But there's a lot of interesting stuff in there, and we're starting to look at it from national perspective and for some of the issues going on around Connect Ed, but a lot of the local governments, a lot of the local planning teams have also used it to really identify assets in their area and say, okay, the school has a fiber connection going into it, but the surrounding neighborhood doesn't. What would it cost us to get the lateral out to that? Can we raise the money? Can we use community development block grant money? And that's where these planning teams come in, and you've got people, you've got data people and IT people and telecom people, and you've got local organizations who really care about the issue, and that really drives this sort of kind of multi-stakeholder processes.
And on that,
Maybe, like, wrap up this question and then one quick question, and then we'll open it up to the board.
I was just going to add to that, the demand piece has come into play in New York City recently. We, through Connect NYC, one of our related programs, we work with the internet service providers and have a partnership where the city will, the construction costs for the client are fully covered. So if a client is willing to sign up for a year of service, then the installation and construction fees are completely waived. So you are expanding the network based on that demand piece, which I hope will continue to be a big part of how the map data can continue to spur growth.
And actually, that's a nice segue into my next question. If you want to expand, or Ann or Mike, to kind of talk about who are the kind of partners you're looking at to kind of help maintain and enhance the data that you're collecting in your maps, and how do you see those partnerships existing? Is it well, I'll just let you all take it from there.
It's certainly, we've seen in New York a multi-stakeholder problem. So you have the landlords that need to be involved, the internet service providers, the tenants, and certainly government. So continuing that conversation and building those connections.
So, for us, the data bubbles up from the state level. And that often is a cross-agency group and often a cross-sector group, and that's really the most, that gets a lot of variety of conversation, people coming in from different viewpoints and different knowledge bases about, how. Let me give an example of one way of verification. So orthophotography, which is aerial photography. And someone was telling us in Indiana, one of the first applications that they had was they had a community that didn't have any access. And it was the guy who owned the ortho in the state who said, hey, why don't we look at the aerial photography and see if there's any kind of line of sight access where we could get wireless into this community. And that's not something that the broadband people had thought about because they weren't thinking about aerial photography, but it was the guy who owned this other asset. And that's why it's so important that having other people. From a real practical standpoint, again, from the government perspective, when you have people, we'd love to decide always what we get to do, but other people tell us. And so in our case, it was a 5-year grant program to support states, and the grant program is going to end. And when that program ends, the map is actually going to be transferred over to the FCC, and they're going to be incorporating it into their 477 program, which is obviously a long-standing program, and they're incorporating this into that. So there's a whole other piece there about how that happens.
Yeah, so there's a unique tension there of voluntary nature and sort of regulatory authority that requires data collection that will juggle over time. But the other one that I think we're going to explore lots more of is this notion of crowdsourcing. So just like this application I mentioned earlier, the FCC speed test that's Android, we'll probably end up doing quite a bit more of that in not just the broadband availability sector, but perhaps even other areas. And I would imagine that's a unique avenue that government will exploit more and more, because it offers potentially a massive opportunity for data collection at a very, very low burden. And I use that word particularly because it's allocated in the Paperwork Reduction Act.
Yeah, I'd just say that a large part of what we do is about connecting community-based organizations, which are really hungry for data and evidence to, make the case for the kinds of changes that they want to see, but don't necessarily know how to access the data or where to find it. And so I think there's a really necessary link there, and it's part of what we do, but there's a lot more capacity needed to make those connections and make sure that community groups can really leverage the resources that that government is providing. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
So I think we'll take some questions from the audience. I can walk around so we can make sure to get you recorded.
Hi, my name is Preston Ray. I'm at the Open Technology Institute at New America Foundation. Disclosure, one of the panelists, Greta Byrum, is on my team at OTI. I would just like to know, what is the change you want to see happen because of the mapping work you've done?
I guess. From our perspective, I want to see more businesses that are wired and a further developed infrastructure grid in New York City. So it's pretty straightforward. It's about actually facilitating those connections and building the network and creating more access.
You know, when we started this, I remember being at a panel where there were a bunch of really angry people who were saying, how is this possible? This is going to be impossible to get this data at this level. Companies are never going to provide it. You're never going to get it from other sources. And it happened. And I mean, even in states where they had incredibly open sunshine laws and a provider wouldn't even give them data, they triangulated tons of third-party and on-the-ground data in other states, going to state fairs and getting people to get it, and eventually, turn the hand of folks who weren't interested in participating. And, I want to see us getting closer and closer, more and more granular, depending on the needs of what people are going to use it for. Depending on if you're using it for really local economic, like what you're using it for, you've got to have building data. There's other uses where you don't need that, and census block works great. And so it's continuing to use that data to drive economic development. It's using it for environmental concerns in different communities and all sorts of those, but continuing to use the data as sort of a live and open asset that people can, repurpose for whatever that they need.
So, I mean, I'll answer not as a representative of the FCC, but like as a person and as a father. I think I want to see less words. I want to see more maps. I want to be in the place where my kid, who's 11, has the opportunity to stand there like Scotty with a tricorder. And that these data just become part of the global ecology in every vertical asset that we know about, so that we can answer questions that while you're on the train driving down, you're doing just common research, and it just is part of everyday life. So broadband is just one vertical, but when we broke the barrier of there's no way you can do this, that you can develop a national map in 9 months at a census block level, meant that we could do that for truckloads of other things. All of those other things should be readily available for my 5th grader. That's what I want to see.
I guess for us, this kind of data is one of the most stark places that you can look to understand issues of equity and access and opportunity. And, I think that people don't necessarily don't know that it's there, and don't know that they can, that they can look at these maps and really see a portrait of access that's just so, access to opportunity in this country that's so plain and so clear. So I hope that our work will remind everybody that there still is a digital divide, and that, when there's sort of this common assumption that everybody has access to digital services, that's really not the case.
Actually, I have a question for Virginia. New York, start again. I have a question for Virginia. New York, as many of you know, just went through a transition. in mayors. Mayor Bloomberg was a friend of the tech community, and he was behind a number of the initiatives that came up today, everything from NYC Big Apps to the projects that you've been working on. He brought on Rachel Hote, Chief Digital Officer, first of those for the city, and I think probably around the country as well. So what I'm wondering is, through this transition, has EDC been working with the de Blasio transition team? Have you seen support for the initiatives that you've been working on? Of course, the map you just posted was in beta, and we'd like to see it in its full version. So if you could comment on that.
Yep, I was anticipating a question associated with the transition. But yes, Bloomberg has been a steward of the tech community, and a lot of these initiatives are based in his original policy decisions. But regardless, tech is a huge part of New York City's economy now, and will continue to be. So for any mayor and for de Blasio, it certainly continues to be a priority. We were working with the transition team. EDC's president has been reappointed, so many of the initiatives that we're already working on will continue moving forward. So we have the same priorities as an organization, and tech is still one of the top priorities for economic development. So hopefully we'll continue to see that commitment.
Hi. So one issue that I've seen perhaps not addressed as thoroughly as some others, and this happens a lot because some people believe it's somewhat self-evident, but what do you anticipate that the primary uses of the broadband would be? I remember a couple of years ago, Ellie Noem and Blair Levin got into some argument about speed, and over the years we've sort of seen that there have been a lot of intensive applications that have been developed in which you have required sort of speed and usage demands that were not previously anticipated. So when we talk about broadband availability and broadband deployment going forward, what do you anticipate the primary uses of that broadband actually being, and how do you anticipate that might hold up given future developments?
So did you say, I had a little trouble hearing, the use of the broadband data, or you're saying use of broadband in general?
Use of broadband in general. In other words, you know, when we talk about broadband being availability, sure, now they've got it. What's going to happen with it? What are they going to use it for?
Well, I think huge question, but the biggest thing that I think we continue to see really speaks to what Mike was saying, which is ubiquity in our lives. And it's really, when you think of the Internet of Things and you think of sensors, and whether you're talking about agriculture and you're talking about the availability to have sensors on your agriculture in the Central Valley so that you can use precious water resources efficiently, or whether you're talking about the ability to do true interactive distance learning, or whether you're talking about the ability to have a gig so that you don't have to develop an entire production line and can use a 3D printer in some other state to see your beta object. I mean, those are all of these different uses, and sometimes it's about an immense push of bandwidth at one point, and sometimes it's that surge, and sometimes it's about having the sort of continuous, you need to have the continuous quality of data because you've got to continue picking up billions and billions of data points and then owning that. I mean, when we talk about there's the ability of someone to look and say, okay, this appliance or this, is costing me a lot of money on my electricity bill, and being able to get down to that level of detail. But that takes a ubiquity, right? And you look at Chattanooga, right? And we all know about Chattanooga because of the gig. But not everyone knows that the reason Chattanooga was able, and why part of the reason they built out that fiber network, was because they wanted to have a smart grid technology, and they needed to have sensors, and they need to have that ability to every home, and you have to have quality internet access to do that. And quality doesn't mean, some very basic speed. It means that you've got low latency, and you've got high speeds, and whenever you need the data, it's coming through. It's not going, packets here and then packets lost, because then you can't make good decisions around it. So I think it's really that Internet of Things that's going to drive that next phase.
Yeah, I can't answer what the most is, but I can say what some of the ones we're interested in policy-wise at the FCC. So one is clearly E-rate, and I think if you just read the flowery language, it's great for schools to have internet, right? But there's a significant driver. No Child Left Behind is sort of the national policy, and part of that national policy is standardized testing. And part of standardized testing means 100% of kids in school on a particular day are going to be online taking a test, which means we have to calculate the bandwidth for everyone to do that so that we can understand what those scores are and, provide all the metrics. So there are drivers in that sector, which is interesting. And fortunately, those things might be able to bleed over and offer a really interesting economic development and other community benefit that we can't determine. There was another one, but it's escaping me. So, there are these interesting, health. So in the health sector, the massive reduction in cost for home health aides by simple deployment of things like pH testing in blood samples that will automatically ping, your VA doctor and say, here's that sample and you need to do X. It has not just significant health benefits, but significant cost reduction. So I think we're seeing all kinds of interesting applications and drivers, and that's a wonderful market to watch. The last one I'd say is Tech Bits. Anyone read Tech Bits? New York Times tech section. So yesterday's section had this full-page, beautiful spread on a company that I love, Stamen Designs in San Francisco, and the whole point of the article was Stamen is revolutionary in looking at new and innovative designs, particularly in mapping. The designs that they employ are available today because of high-speed broadband. We see the opportunity to visualize data in fantastic new ways that are far more applicable than just like, what's the visuality of tweets from MTV Music Video Awards or something like that. So we're seeing just novel approaches that I think are just wonderful to watch, and it's a great article.
I'd just say there's a trajectory, right? And there's always going to be a need for more and more capacity in these pipelines. And so the big issue would be transparency and reporting, I think, and ensuring that people are getting the speeds that they pay for. So I think that's the bottom line from our perspective. Yeah.
When, as New York approaches our economic development strategy, we're moving more and more towards fiber, where the technology wouldn't necessarily be the limiting factor. It'd be, as far as like the capacity of speed that you have access to, it's what you're willing to pay for. So as technology develops and companies are requiring more and more bandwidth, the installation would already be there. They just call their company and increase the amount they're paying for, right?
And I'll just one last point on that. As the official representative of, the nonprofit community, I'll just say that there is also an issue as far as how people are accessing services. People in poorer and more underserved communities are likely to access broadband via mobile devices. So you're looking at different kinds of speeds and different capacities for those, and that continues to be an issue, especially when it comes to the kinds of services that people expect and the kinds of things that you need in order to participate in a 21st century economy.
A large suite of our initiatives that aren't necessarily tied to our mapping, but are free public Wi-Fi networks. So we definitely pay, at least in New York City, are paying close attention to the digital divide issue, and certainly what you pointed out, that people are accessing this via their mobile phones and not necessarily needing the fiber installation, but mobile technologies.
Hi, Peter Flynn from Texas Instruments. You've highlighted the ad hoc nature of your collection and the cloud sourcing characteristics of this and rolling it all up from the multiple states. How are you addressing the relevance of the data? How do you keep it up to date, which is going to be one of the biggest challenges you have going forward? Are you doing any auditing to validate that your map's accurate, or what percentage of your maps are accurate on an ongoing basis or anything of that nature?
So let me just real quick with when we started the data set, so We incorporated this verification element at the state level, and there's work that we also do at the federal level. We provided states with funding to collect data twice a year for 5 years. When the grants, and part of our goal was if we had a very long grant program, we could help states build their case for why they needed to continue to their state legislatures or to local city councils about why they had to continue funding this program and why they had to continue having people who knew and cared about this issue on staff. So even though the FCC is going to be collecting data through the 477 process, we still have states who want to continue collecting their own data set, who are going to continue verifying data about their state, who now have staff who know who to contact at the FCC and say, hey, we have concerns about this, or we really agree with this, or there's this new provider that's just opened up. But I should say, I don't want to make it seem as if there was sort of an ad hoc collection process. We developed a very, very discrete set of deliverables in terms of at each census block what was to be collected for every provider, so that it was all developed into one national data set. So I do want to be very clear. It wasn't as if, and what part of what happens at the state level is sometimes they get a map on a napkin or a yellow highlight around a Rand McNally atlas, and they have to interpret that and then go back and talk with the provider and talk with local communities and say, is this what this availability really looks like? Because especially for very small providers, they didn't, it's literally, oh, we have 2 people on our staff and no one knows how to do GIS. We have a CAD drawing from 15 years ago. Would that help? And so there's a lot of, particularly with small providers, there's been a lot of technical assistance to try to help them understand census geography.
Yeah, I would say if I led anyone to believe that our data collections are ad hoc, I apologize. It wasn't our intent at all, and I don't think they are. When it comes to the future collections of those things, the FCC changed its rules around Form 477 so that they're actually codified that providers will provide data on availability for the foreseeable future. So that's an ongoing process. It's not going to happen, and I would say that FCC's process in that is remarkably similar to how NTIA developed SBDDD. So there isn't an ad hoc nature in my mind. Secondly, yeah, we perform audits. We look very rigorously at the data at a national scale. It's probably a longer description than we could provide here. Suffice it to say, it's something analogous to what a national map accuracy assessment would be for something like FEMA floodplain zones or something like that.
So I think we're actually a little over our time, but I think that's a testament to how not only important this issue is, but how interesting it can be. I'll just like to leave our panelists with just a minute or two just for some closing thoughts on your thoughts on the future of mapping and broadband.
Sure. Leading off of that last question, I think the crowdsourcing piece also comes into play when you're talking about validating data, rating your service, commenting on your service. So that's something that our map incorporates and the state level map, so at least the New York state level map, and is a very important part of the broadband conversation moving forward.
So for me, when I started this work, I was an AmeriCorps Vista volunteer. And it was literally the AmeriCorps Vista supervisor who said, oh, you used to work in the campus tech lab, right? Can you develop a community center? They got 30 gateway computers and they're sitting in a shed. And you have $8,000 to go build a community technology center. And I was 22 and was like, yeah, that sounds awesome. And I remember our chief economist at NTIA just retired after 35 years, and I told him how I remembered the day I was on one of the computers in our lab, and I found these falling through the net reports that NTIA had started putting out, and I think 94, 95, where it started talking. It was the first time the word digital divide got used. And I remember just being floored and saying, wow, what I'm doing is this little tiny part of this really big movement to ensure digital equity. And this is part of a larger social justice mission. And I was in a social services agency where we worked with foster youth, and we worked mainly with youth and kinship providers. And so we worked with foster youth, and we worked with a youth a homeless shelter that worked with youth, and I had an after-school program, and it was just this kind of amazing experience, and it's always grounded me. And what you said about nonprofits looking for like data for their grants, I mean, that was one of the things I always struggled with, because you have to show when you're a nonprofit how horribly underprivileged you are, because you have to show that you're the most underprivileged, but that you have enough capacity to manage the money that's going to come in. And so it's this fine line you walk, and that was when we were developing the map, one of the things we said is we want to give local communities stats that they can take to a city council person or to a state legislature and say, we've got a problem we want to solve, or this is part of this other solution. And so that to me has been this really exciting piece of that, is trying to link it to all of these other activities, and that's kind of what really grounds me. And when I think about what's next, I always think about the community center that I worked at and that's still there, and how would they want to use the data, and how would the decisions that we're making here in DC impact that community and that community center.
That's killer. I think what's next for me is this concept that we're playing with in the speed test data that we're getting in as examples, and the concepts that we're playing with are real-time weather maps for broadband, so that we begin to see what the landscape of signal strength or providers or speed is, but in a real-time fashion. And this kind of time to market in data turnaround is, we're just starting to see, but I think we're at a cusp where we can begin to play with it.
I think, so you mentioned before the Universal Service Fund and the guarantee of telephony for everybody in the entire country. We don't have anything like that for broadband, and that has to do with a wonky and legal issue around how broadband services are classified, which is not as telephony, but as information services. So because there is no official legal mandate for universal service, that means that ensuring universal service is really up to all kinds of actors at the local level, the state level, the federal level. And I think data is the most important tool that we have for ensuring that service is universal and that people have access to what they need. So we will continue to use it that way and try to highlight those uses so that others know how to do that.
Thanks. I'd like to thank all of you, and also thanks to our organizers for putting together such a great panel. Class dismissed.